Thank you, Joe, Angela, and Menching for joining us today for the Era Gin and Tonic. So today we've got Dr. Cate Pemble, who is a social scientist and research fellow at the University of Stirling with an interdisciplinary background in sociology, psychology, and disability studies. Their work focuses on the intersection of social structures, physical spaces, and interpersonal relationships, highlighting the importance of individual action in creating and maintaining inclusive neighbourhoods and communities. In Kate's presentation, they will be exploring the practical and ethical considerations involved in developing high-profile research projects, drawing on experiences with the Designing Homes for Healthy Cognitive Aging project funded by the Healthy Aging Challenge, and their current work on the Changing Intergenerational Relationships regional case study. Kate offers an honest reflection on the challenges of creating, running, and sharing research that prioritises community voices. And then alongside that, Kate will be sharing their recipe for the fanciest warm drinks, the London Fog. So whenever you're ready, Kate, please do take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the intro. Let me swap this over um, so everyone can hopefully see and hear me at ideally the same time. There we go. Perfect. Love that for us. Okie doke. So thank you so much for the welcome. I am, as it said, Cate Pemble. I do have a PhD over in social science in dementia studies, technically, though I think, as we all know, the technical name on your PhD is often not reflective of literally everything that you do. So today what I wanted to offer is a little bit of an insight into some of the practicalities around co-production and around impact, because as I have moved further away from the PhD and further into research fellow roles, that has been increasingly part of what has ended up on my plate. And I don't think it was something that the pure literature necessarily prepared me for. So let us move on. Let's talk about why me for a start. As Amy mentioned, I'm currently working on the Changing Intergenerational Relationships project. That's an ESRC funded project that uses community peer researchers, which means we're working hand in hand with members of the community who volunteer to be part of the team. We try and make them as equal members as it's possible to do and as they want to do. I'll talk a bit about that. Before that, I was doing the Designing Homes for Healthy Cognitive Aging project, which was UKRI funded, included peer researchers, but also had in tow industrial partners working in construction and architecture and design, so coming from a really different background, as well as having an older people's reference group, which is slightly separate. And before that, I'd done and been on projects with other groups of what I would now call community peer researchers, but at various times we've called volunteer researchers, peer guides, all kinds of lingo that essentially means the same thing. So that's my background, and everything that I'm presenting today is based in the literature, yes, but then definitely contextualized and expanded through experience. So take, please, whatever is useful and leave the rest. So let's start with a little bit of definition, because would we be academics if we didn't? So co-production is one of the quintessential social science terms where it is so much easier to talk about what it isn't than what it is. There are a huge number of theories and attempts to define it or define what it isn't, but broadly speaking, if you break them all down, co-production is at its best interpersonal, so connections in between people. It's egalitarian, it is accessible across the board, it's equitable, it is ongoing, it tends to run, and my experience has been in a lot of cases where it runs well. Connections with community peer researchers will go from one project to the next because they are invested not only in the project that they're on, but potentially in their relationship with you as a researcher and their role in research more generally. It's immersive, it's something that draws the community in and keeps them engaged every single part of the process. It's responsive, so it's something that those people who are partners in co-production respond to what you are saying, but also we within the academe respond to what they are saying and what their insights are. And it's evolving. You 100%, if you start doing co-productive work, will tweak and alter your approach every single time that you do a new project, because you're always learning, because it's fundamentally an interpersonal skill set and an interpersonal practice. However, it's also intrapersonal, right? So looking at not just the connections between individuals, but connections out to who these people represent. So as you're pulling in potentially local authority members and thinking about who those are connected to and what those other connections are, things can start to get a little bit complicated. It's riddled with imbalance, whether that is between peer researchers and the academics themselves, in terms of when they were brought in, did they have a hand in designing the bid in the first place? Is it something that we pulled in later? Can they fundamentally change some aspects of the work that you need to do, or are some of those set in stone and promised to the funder? It's always imperfect. It's always imperfect. There is no right way to do co-production. It's going to change all the time, and you are going to experience failure sometimes. That's just part of the process. It is massively time consuming to do well, and that often gets left out of the formal writing, and particularly when we think about how we talk about it in terms of bids and bid preparation. Building those relationships with people, inviting people in, working out how to facilitate them best, working out how to upskill them, working out how to include them, working out how to mediate things when they go wrong. All of these take time, and we need to be very aware of that as we go into it. It can be incredibly overwhelming for all the reasons stated above, but also because the potential for doing good and the potential for impact and doing something with meaning is so big. Navigating through and choosing when to cut off certain opportunities adds a whole other level of complexity. It's constrained by time, by people's capacity, by funding, by bids, by the institution, all of these things. So at once, both freeing and constrained, and it's infinitely complex. Now, the other thing we need to speak about while we're talking about co-production is a slide about what is it, because I remembered this was in this place. So definitely changes over time, but the thing I want to flag up here is how big funders have started to talk about co-production, because it's one thing to look at the wider literature about co-production and co-design and how those fit together, of which there are many, many articles, and a lot of them are very insightful, and how our actual funders start to define what co-production is and what it looks like when we are doing proper co-production. So the NIHR, for example, argues that doing co-production looks like the building and maintaining of those relationships between the people who volunteer or come on board the project and yourselves. It looks like sharing power, so it looks like handing insight and respect and power over to those people who are coming in with you, and recognizing that while their skill sets are not yours and while their insights are not academic, they are nevertheless really, really valuable, and it is genuinely something that you're not likely to get just working with academics alone. It involves respecting and valuing the knowledge of everyone on board, whether that is communicated in a highfalutin academese kind of way, or in a much more grounded communication. And it is reciprocal. They are getting something back from it. That's sometimes, not particularly often, in terms of money. They can be paid for their time, or they can be reimbursed for their time. Often it's in terms of a sense of meaning or a sense of contribution or an interest, that kind of thing, but it should be reciprocal. Now, this is what I'm going to say. The thing that co-production goes hand in hand with, particularly as we move forward towards Ref 29, is impact, right? Impact previously in other parts of particularly the Ref, and speaking in the UK context, is an attempt to quantify a change or a benefit that the researchers had for the economy, society, for culture, for people, for services, for literally anyone outside academia. It can include positive influences on people's activity or on their behaviour or on the way that they communicate or interact with one another, but it doesn't have to. It can also include things like risk reduction and dealing with costs and that kind of thing. So all of those would be counted as impact because primarily they're happening outside academia, right? They're impacting something in the world that is not within that ivory tower. It's assessed, broadly speaking, on both its reach and its significance. So how many people this impact touched? Is it constrained to one particular group of people? Does it go beyond that? Start to see where co-production can come into it. But also, what was the significance of it? How big was the difference? And that can be really tricky, particularly if you are working in qualitative rather than quantitative work. And in practice, very, very difficult to track. So even on the projects I've worked on where we've had co-production at the core, where we've developed resources that are meaningful and were needful, we have then pushed those out and we can track that initial push, right? This booklet went to 33,000 occupational therapists, for example. We know that. We don't know beyond that how often it's used, who they then went on to share it with, what that impact is. So it gets a bit spurious after that. It's also worth knowing that as you're starting to think about this in a kind of practical perspective, that every single group has a slightly different idea of what impact is or what it should be. So this lovely graph, which I stole, reference below, shows that even between the natural sciences, the social sciences and the humanities, what impact is, what counts as impact, what's important impact, chops and changes. Now this is really, really important, not just for pulling our teams together, not just in terms of going for bids and going for funding and that kind of thing, but in remembering that in co-production and in seeking impact, this is going to be interpersonal relationships. This is going to be dealing with people and trying to draw together a collective idea that what does impact, what does co-production look like for this project? What can this project achieve, right? So let's talk a little bit about the challenges. There is a need to establish and then throughout the project re-establish what co-production looks like, what impact looks like. What is the project doing? Are we still happy? How are we working together? Are we still happy with that? It's an ongoing process that takes time and takes maintenance, but it's really, really important. Once you start to get out of step with the people that you're co-producing with, that's where you can start to see some rifts and some tensions come in that can have a really big impact down the line. It's about understanding the motivations, why people are drawn to the table, whether that's an individual interest, whether that is personal experience with a particular condition, dementia, for example, whether that is a professional interest. So we did the work on design. Did someone come and join us because they were themselves perhaps an architect and wanted to improve their practice at the same time as supporting the research? All of these things will bring people to the table in a slightly different way. Increase tenfold when you start moving to professional partners that you might co-produce with. So every organisation will have its own reasons for getting involved and for devoting resources. And keeping a track of those is an essential part of making sure you're keeping all of those relationship plates spinning, right? Everyone came to the research for a reason, and as a result, they're all going to be looking for something slightly different. There's a need to maintain open communication and address concerns. That means not only when concerns are brought to you, responding to them, but it also means fostering a connection with each and every one of those stakeholders you're co-producing with, where they feel comfortable telling you that something is wrong, right? There is a real potential for people to kind of nod along, to not want to rock the boat or to not want to upset you. Particularly if they are older and you are younger and there's that age dynamic in there, creating a situation where they know they can come to you and say, listen, the way you ran that meeting, that was not it for us. Can we try something different? Is both a sign that something's going really, really well because they can come to you, and a sign that something needs to be changed because there's something for them to come to you about. Notice always that the power dynamics can shift. Stakeholders who come in and have quite a lot of oomph and quite a lot of say at one part of the project may not be those who have the biggest oomph later on in the project. Keeping just a weather eye on those power dynamics is really important. And empowering them at every stage to say yes, to say no, and particularly to ask the uncomfortable questions and the stupid questions, right? you will never have a more holistic and kind of 360 view of what the project is doing than why than when you empower your community researchers to stick their hand up and say, sorry, I just want to double check this thing and ask you a question that comes from not only left field, but like 45 degrees off angle left field. Once you've started to look at things from that perspective, it really can show things up, but it can lead to some quick dancing on the ground. So let's start with the practicalities from here. Who and why? Who are we engaging in co-production and why are we doing it? Depending on your topic, your potential net of co-productive partners can be cast really, really, really wide, right? Something like housing design, aging, I can make an argument for 90% of the population because most of us are really looking to get old, right? Most of us would like to live in a house and be old at the same time. However, that's not a feasible way to go forward identifying and recruiting and maintaining connections with our co-productive partners. So processes, as I've gone through them, thinking about who is directly affected by this issue, both positively and negatively, right? So thinking about something like technology, who is not necessarily having access to technology, who might be having an issue here, but also who might be often flying with this kind of tech, who might be really enjoying it, who might be really benefit from it. Those are two voices, both of which would be really valuable as a co-productive partner. Who's often left out? In my experience, this is often marginalised communities who are only spoken to when the research is explicitly about them. So if you are not doing work on queer identities or BME communities or disabled folks, for example, I would always recommend using co-production as an opportunity to invite those voices in explicitly, because those are aspects and factors that you will not necessarily have access to on your own. Who is interested in taking part? Those are maybe some of your easier wins, but also who might not want to take part? Who might be reticent about taking part and why? So working on now an intergenerational project that is focusing on an area with quite a lot of deprivation, recognising that in the first instance, the university is an official looking organisation, and if I rock up in my suit, for example, I might look like the social, right? And that represents a barrier to people. So recognising what the barriers might be to interaction, to taking part, and looking at how those can be managed if they're manageable at all. Recognising what the risks are of bringing these groups together. So if, for example, you are working with a group with a history of having issues with access to social care, for example, there are power dynamics and there are risks involved in bringing together people who receive care, receive support in some manner with the people who provide it, right? That is a risk, yes, to group dynamics, but more importantly to how can everybody in this room share in an equal way? Ignore this cat, I'm so sorry. How can everybody share in an equal way, knowing that they are safe from that impacting the provision of their care, for example, going forwards? Work out as much as possible what success looks like for each of these stakeholders. As you're bringing them in, as you're collecting your team and you're wildly recruiting, what does success look like for them? They will have particular problems that brought them to the table, and they might have particular ideas about what it is that success even looks like, and whether you can meet those goals. I would recommend starting having uncomfortable conversations as early as possible. Be explicit. Ask people, oh, what is it that drew you to research? What do you want out? And if they say something that you cannot do, in that moment, tell them. Tell them what you can do, tell them what you can't do. Tell them what you're concerned about. I think it's possible that we'll be able to do something like that, but it's going to really come down to the timing or the resources or where the data leads us. If they then choose that that's not the project, this isn't the project for them, that's fine. If they choose to stay, they're doing so in the knowledge that their original idea of what they might get out of it might not be something that's on the table. So that's more of a respectful and fully informed consent and choice. The other thing I want you to think about, as particularly as an early career researcher, because in general we will be jumping on projects that somebody else designed the brief for, but often it will be up to us to turn that into practicality, to work out, okay, this is what was promised in the bid, this is the steer I've been given by my PI, how do I actually process this in explicit enough terms that we can put in an ethics application, for example, right? it's really easy while you're thinking about impact and co-production in that kind of procedural way to get really focused on what I'd call kind of downstream stakeholders, right? People who you can gently cascade out little blobs of knowledge, little pieces of outputs, little events, little talks, whatever, who might receive those. Thankfully, thank you, great university, wonderful researchers, we're so grateful. Those are important stakeholders. They absolutely are, but they're not the only ones that you're going to have to manage as you're going through this process of doing it, because you also have these kind of upstream silent bodies. So you have the funders who were promised a certain something in the bid text itself. Whether you are able to flex on that and how much you're able to flex on that and how your PI wants to deal with it are all key factors here, but it's always worth having a whether eye on what was promised, so that you don't get to the last 6 to 9 months of the project and realise, damn, we said we were going to do a policy brief, for example, and our co-production and our outputs and our impact has taken us a completely different direction. So thinking about those kind of upstream and downstream partners. What I will say as well is that, weirdly, this kind of co-productive work, this kind of impact-driven activity is one of the places where, as an early career researcher, you have the most power, right? Co-production and impact are both done on the ground level. And for the most part, in most projects, our PIs are not funded for that kind of day-to-day grunt work. They just don't have the time on projects to be out there making these relationships, to be out there like working through these problems with our co-productive teams, our peer researchers and so on. So that's where you have quite a lot of flex. If you want to push and make sure that there is a reach out into a particular community, or that it reaches out and knocks on certain doors, you as the person who's taking the lead on actually making that happen can do that. There will always be limits and things will never exactly go to plan, but that's a place where you actually flexing your muscle and flexing your activity can actually have quite a big impact. And ditto, how involved your peer researchers, your co-productive partners are, how they want to do it, what they want to manage, what that's going to look like. That's something that you are often actively negotiating with them over time. So that's a place where you can also have quite a bit of influence in that relationship. So let's talk, very kind of blasting through, about some of the practicalities of this. We've talked about what the issues are, we've talked about what the ideals are, so what's the practicalities? So the first one I think is the most important to deal with is issues around power. Power is never going to be equal within co-production or within impact activities, right? Because fundamentally, research is usually situated at the university, which is going to give the academic team a certain amount of power. You will have made promises, or the bid will have made promises to funders, which locks you into a certain thing. The ethics committee and how your ethics committee works will put certain limitations on what you can and can't do. All of these things serve to potentially take power out of the hands of the people that you are wanting to co-produce with, right? So how you look at rebalancing those is really, really important. So making sure that as much as possible, you're being clear about what your limitations are. If you've said we want to bring co-productive partners on, we want them to be full members of the team, which is how the projects I've been on tend to operate. We're then, quite transparent about, so the next part of this project is we're going to sit down and do the boring graft work around putting together an ethics application. Perfectly happy to explain to you what that looks like and get you involved if you want, but it is essentially just like a long administrative task. What do you think? And then a lot of times they will then say, no, that sounds like a you problem. Let me know when it's done. But it's about making these kind of things really transparent. Thinking about always the power dynamics within the groups themselves, and keeping an eye on those, and how those power dynamics impact your outputs, right? One of the biggest ways that co-production and impact and power can interact is about how we communicate out to the community what it is that we've found. So the discussions we have about what is or isn't appropriate, what language we should or shouldn't use, what images we should or should not use, right? So being really aware of how power inside that room and outside that room is affecting that conversation is 100%, I think, part of facilitating this whole co-productive and impact process. And then just looping around all the time, checking back in. Do you understand? Are you happy? Is this going in the right direction? Are you good? Just over and over again, constantly checking in. Ideally not in a way that drives people crazy, but if it happens, it happens. The next thing is timing. This is huge for co-productive work and for impact. There's a tendency, particularly in short-term funding bids, to think about impact as a thing that happens in the last 3 or 4 months. That sets a very hard road for you. It tends to be better to start to think about these things as soon as possible. So think about if this is a project that you're running or a project that you've landed on and you need to work out the practicalities of that. When is it I actually need people to be co-producing with me? Okay, so I need them on deck for that point. So I need to recruit them early in that, right? Because we need to have them ready to go when we get to that point where I actually need them. And then actually, you probably need to start even earlier than that, because you need to start the process of reaching out, making connections, particularly if you're trying to work with marginalised or community groups or people who are not necessarily as comfortable reaching out to the university, especially if they have not been to university themselves, right? It's a really, really time-consuming process, and it can drag on. That's okay. It's not an issue. It is just something you have to kind of plan for. Maintaining regular communication. We always recommend talking to them ahead of time. How would you like to be communicated with? Do you want monthly emails? Do you want us to set up? Our current project is using Canva, which is your Moodle Blackboard equivalent. There's a space in there for them to collaborate in between meetings, and it lets us put calendar updates. Do they want something like that? Do they want a newsletter? Do they want monthly meetings? Do they want quarterly meetings? Having those kind of conversations and making that a production that you do together, I think, can really, really help. And offering real opportunities for engagement. It's not tokenistic. It is, hey, there's an opportunity to present here. Hey, we've got an opportunity to write something here. Hey, we've got an opportunity to make something or do something. Do you want to be involved? Is that something that you're interested in? If they say no, that's fine, continue as normal. If they say yes, that's then something that you can do together, and that could be really, really meaningful for them. Managing those relationships and cultivating them. I think I've banged on about this quite a bit because it's important, but these kind of relationships often happen at a one-to-one level, right? So it can be building time for your connections with individual volunteers, co-productive researchers, whatever you want to call them, peer researchers, as well as with them as a group. That can mean meeting them for coffee to talk something through. That can mean the time that you spend walking to and from the train if you're going to the same location, all that kind of stuff. But all that communication, all that interaction is really, really important to building a sturdy group. Providing the support and the resources for them to be involved throughout the project, especially if they are putting themselves out there and saying, actually, I would quite like to be involved in analysis, for example. I would like to be involved in this presentation, but I'm really nervous about public speaking and I don't know how to do the analysis. What can you put in place to support them to do that? Can you put on a wee workshop about how the analysis works and help them step through that? Can you work with them on presentation and give them an opportunity to practice and all that kind of stuff? What is it that you can offer? How can you support their development so they're getting something out of this process as well? Recognise that they're already coming with a raft of skills and expertise. We have had people who shine in workshop situations, for example, and others who will shrivel up and die if you put them in front of people, but will very happily go line by line through a document and find every single errant comma. Both of them are such gifts, but figuring out what they're bringing, that's the tricky part, especially because a lot of times if people aren't used to working with a university, they might think that those skills are not important or they're not fancy enough or they're not worth mentioning when they absolutely are. So that's part of that interpersonal communication, bringing those out. Encouraging them to take and give the time that works for them. They can be more and less involved over time. A lot of times people will try and give a lot because that's what they feel they should do. There's a little bit of responsibility on you for checking that and making sure that that is feasible for them and they're not overextending themselves. On the other hand, there is a limit to that. I've run into it where I am concerned about asking too much of someone who's giving their time voluntarily. and relying on unpaid labour, only to find out later that they would have really valued the opportunity to help out more and to have deadlines and to have clear responsibilities. So I said it was always evolving and it was always imperfect. That was one of the takeaways from Deshka to my most recent project. So we're always just developing. It's worth keeping an eye out for. Facilitate those hard conversations, reflect on what isn't working. We found that having a yearly check-in about what is and isn't working is really good, even if it looks like everything's going perfectly on the surface. And remember that they are investing not just in the project, but in you as an individual and their relationship with you. So it's really valuable to them, and it's kind of up to us to respect that and treat that relationship with that kind of respect and value. Thinking about what they're going to be involved with, what is it they're actually going to do? What is their capacity for them to do? If there are certain parts of the project that they can absolutely be involved in and others they can't, making that clear to them and making sure that avenues for engagement are as clear and open as possible, and looking at how do we keep them at least informed of these other parts so that they can be full partners in the process. Working together to create your guidelines and your rules for what are we going to do as this, what are we going to do as this group? What are the standards we're going to hold ourselves to? When are we going to meet? All of that kind of group work stuff can be really, really valuable. We've started handing out a volunteer contract, which has no legal basis, but essentially outlines, hey, this is what you can expect from us, and this is what we kind of can expect from you, just to outline and put boundaries on those relationships and set those expectations up so it's more as clear as it possibly can be. Be clear about what you're doing and why, what you're creating and why and for who, and make sure that you're constantly communicating that, not just with your peer volunteers and your peer researchers, but also within the team and then with wider stakeholders, particularly as you crash forwards towards things like impact. The best success that we've had has come from asking people what resources that they need and then flexing to that rather than presuming we know what they need. So any opportunity you have to do that kind of groundwork, absolutely do recommend. And then working out what success looks like. This is the really, really tricky bit. As academics, we're never actually satisfied because the problems that we research are never actually fixed. We'd all, I think, quite like to do ourselves out of a job, but we can't. So what does it look like to succeed? To succeed in your little co-productive cluster, your within team. What does running it well look like? When can you celebrate that? Or having those feedback loops for putting this kind of stuff out. Working out ahead of time what you think success looks like makes it so much easier to celebrate it when you do get there. And you will get there. It's just really easy to lose sight of when you're in the trenches and you're doing all the kind of messy interpersonal work, while also potentially balancing a bunch of other kind of academic and career practicalities alongside. The last thing, I'll put you back where you can see me. The last thing I want to show you is a video, which was co-produced by a bunch of our community peer researchers. They were very clear about the fact that they wanted to create a resource that could be enjoyed and used by other researchers, other universities, to not only support people who are just starting their career and thinking about working co-productively, but to go to maybe people who haven't done it as well in the past, or who've never thought of co-production before, or to community members who are not sure why they would volunteer. So this is what they asked for, this is what they made. I'm going to share it with you, and then after that we'll wrap up and I'll take any questions that you have. So here's hoping that the sound works first time. It should do. And go.
The Designing Homes for Healthy Cognitive Ageing project, which we fondly call DESHCA, is all about making sure that we are creating home environments and wider built environments that support healthy cognitive ageing for people growing older, where designs work for everybody. The role of older people in making DESHCA happen is very central. This is called co-production, and we don't have participants in our projects. We have fellow partners, we have researchers that work with us, that have a diverse range of lived experiences, that make sure that our projects are grounded in real life. And it makes total sense to me that to increase ownership of your outputs for research or work the knowledge exchange or make effective impact, you have to work hand in hand with the people that you're doing it for.
Thinking about whether older people's participation really affects outcomes is a really important question that researchers should be thinking about before they even design their research, not at the end of the research. If that only occurs to you when you've finished, then you haven't done it effectively.
If you know that you have gotten the go-ahead to do this project, or this project has gotten funded, then it's really useful at that moment to start thinking about, okay, if we're going to do co-production, who is that? Where can we find them? Who do we need to speak to? And the sooner you can get people in and getting their hands in, the better.
It was very interesting to find out the different motivations that people had for volunteering, and it really is as varied as there were people in the room. I chose to be involved with research because I'm just fascinated to see how we can actually change things for the better.
You either sit around doing nothing, or you try and have an influence and an input. I'd much rather do what I can.
The day-to-day practice of co-production is fundamentally about engaging with people and trying to see what works and what doesn't. And the way that you make those mistakes without it being catastrophic is by making sure you have a really good relationship and a strong relationship with your volunteers and your co-production people.
I think the researchers need to make sure that the volunteer understands what the project is going to involve and explains what the opportunities are and finds out something about the researcher from their experience and their interests so that you can get the right fit between the two sides.
Real co-production isn't a tick box exercise in any way, and it's very much built on trusting relationships, and trusting relationships take a lot of time.
I think it is very difficult to set aside the time and get that two-way exchange of information, because without doing so there's lack of contact and there's lack of involvement, and you can sort of almost feel sidelined to some extent.
How co-production really looks depends on the project that you're doing. And you have to treat it as something that is a continuous challenge, and it's really key to recognise that and to incorporate into your work programme ways of dealing with the challenge.
If the project is a longer one, especially, I think it probably needs to be some checks at certain stages to see that if the volunteers are getting what they want out of the project.
Be very careful to actually develop a working relationship with the people and just be straight with them. And if it is that time has to be taken out, for instance, to get ethic committee approval, don't become embarrassed that you're not being able to get back to somebody. Just be honest and say it'll be a couple of months.
When we think about doing co-production, we plan for the benefits to go in both directions. Obviously, as researchers, we get a huge amount of value from our peer researchers, but it's incredibly important to make sure that we are giving back. If they want to be involved in the writing, if they want to be involved in interviewing, giving them the opportunity to do that and the support to do that really well and in a way that they're comfortable is part of how you honour that relationship and you make sure it's genuinely bi-directional.
I suppose I don't really see lines in terms of academic or volunteers. I just see working with a body and a group of people who are all just enthusiastic and motivated towards a goal. And I think that's how you do co-production. You take away the lines and you make sure that it's an equal and reciprocal partnership.
I think it's important for both academics and volunteers that there is a practical, beneficial outcome to the work. Otherwise, it's just a talking shop. So legacy is vitally important, something tangible. And if you can make a difference and improve life for others, then that's wonderful.
Okie dokie, that is, I think, more than enough hearing from me. We'll open the floor up to any questions that you may have. Thank you very, very much for listening. Cheers.
Thank you, Kate. That was brilliant, very insightful, and I love the promotional video at the end. I thought that was great.